Good morning. So, this will be the second leg of the journey. And I did not mean to create a custom one there. There's this random bug where the map here seems to get super laggy, and that seems to be what has happened here. Hopefully it clears up in game. But I am set to depart out of MCO from the gate that I landed at last time here. It should have us taking off to the south. I want to do 18 left. I don't think that's the direction that I went out. There we go. That's more the route that I took. So I've got it configured. I made a couple misclicks and got it kind of messed up. It's not quite the route that I took, but it's as close as I can get. So I will be taxiing over here to 18 left. We will take off, head south. We may see Key West here. We'll head over parts of Cuba. We'll start coming into South America. Then we'll head down here over this international airport and then loop over, and then we should have a very interesting landing because Costa Rica's got some mountain valleys to the north and to the south of it, and then the runway is kind of in this middle. There's some mountains here over a highway, and then there's more distance off this direction, but every time, I'll say almost every time I've landed at this airport, I have come in on runway 7. I've departed twice on runway 25. I don't think I've ever landed on runway 25. I think just all the times that I've landed, winds have been in this direction, so I've always come in. And it should be a fun little flight with quite a few things to see. So, similar to the last video, I will speed up the flight once I've gotten through departure and once we're kind of airborne on the way. Not going to do a whole bunch of talking head stuff. I will cut to some scenes as we hit coastlines or major airports, things of interest to look at. So as we pass over Cuba here, and then as we approach the coastline and get over anything that's interesting to see mountainous, and then we'll kind of probably cut in and watch as we hit this area here. I'll slow it down a little bit, and then we'll probably resume full one at OC 511, I think, and do real-time approach. Hopefully we'll make it down under the ground. This is a really cool lake if it's the one I'm thinking of. I believe it's that one, but these are two volcanoes, if I recall correctly. Anyway, let's jump in and see how this goes. Alright, so we're doing the full proper start. Normally a plane would start with the jetway connected and we just unloaded baggage, so the truck and everything would be there. And I would also be coming in here to program in all of my flight stuff here into the computer, but again, I don't know how to do any of that. I'm sure I could figure it out. It's just inputting all the codes and learning the different screens to input the waypoints and all the stations, and then here setting all your different comms relays and everything like that. But it's a lot of work. While I don't dislike those functions and I'm glad that they're there, again, I'm trying to play this game as a casual user, not a hardcore sim user. So we are just going to sit back and enjoy the system doing what the system does. Alright, so that was a very smooth takeoff, nothing going on. Taxi was nice and smooth, although I don't know why it wanted me to taxi through the stupid terminal area. Even Tower 3D tries to do that, and I don't know any airport that would just stuff a plane that's going to departure making all those turns through the taxi area and the ramp area. It just makes no sense. But overall, auto throttles kicked in just fine once we started rolling. I kicked on flight director. We're nearing our current 6,000 feet limit for the departure path, so we're in controlled airspace still. You can see on my little chart there that we're heading to the right, and then we're going to bank to the left. And then shortly after that, let me see if I can zoom it out a few more nautical miles here. I think somewhere around this one up here is where we will get off of the departure path. Got it. We're going to climb up again. But as soon as I started rolling, the auto throttle kicked in. I had control until I got airborne enough, and I had my flaps retracted and my speed at a reasonable level. And so then I throttled back to the point on the sticks there. You don't keep them rammed all the way to full. You pull them back a little bit. And oops, I didn't want to do whatever I just did. But you can see here in this gauge, there's some different options. So in this range, it's the auto throttle that will take over and run things. So I just pulled it back from my maximum thrust level back into auto throttle area. And that way it could do its thing. So I had max thrust for takeoff. I pulled it back to CL, which I think is climb. And then shortly after that, I dialed it back to auto throttle once I had my flaps fully retracted and everything was going well. And then that system pulled me at about 200 knots. And then as I got airborne, you can see it's pulled my speed up a little higher. And currently we're set to hold about 250 knots, which is about what we're doing. So everything is good to go. So I will start to throttle up the video, speed up the video here. We'll enjoy some flights, and then once I get up to my cruising altitude, or a little before because it'll take me a while to get there, we'll enjoy the sights as we leave Florida. I'll probably cut this once I pass out a departure, and then we'll just kind of rejoin as we hit the sights on our way out. I'll show you where we are right now. So this was MCO's departure. Tuppy, and I believe Tuppy is the end. That's the one I was pointing to, where we start to head to the left. I believe that's the end of the departure path, and then once I get to Tuppy, I'll climb up higher and get to my departure. So once we come down here to the coast, once we come down here, because Key West is down here, so once we see the Keys, we'll take a look, Cuba, and then when we start hitting the South American coast and get over Colombia and some of the other countries here, and then we'll come back in. So that's kind of the plan. I'll bring the map over a couple of times, show you where we're at, but otherwise, enjoy the flight. Alright, so why am I suddenly headed back towards the ocean now? Well, as called out in the video's title, there were several issues that I had with approach. So, yeah, this is my fourth approach that we're seeing right now that had failed. And I'll have an overlay here in just a second of the first two. But my first issue on the first approach was that I was coming in towards the ocean and the autopilot started making an incorrect turn. Second approach, I came in and the autopilot wasn't descending, even when on approach. It just was maintaining the 8,000 feet that the ATC had told me to maintain. Third approach, I came in, but I stalled out because I was trying to get the altitude down. Fourth approach, I came in differently from a different angle to try and see if I could get the autopilot to work, which is the one that we're watching on the main screen now that failed and I'm flying away from. And then the final approach, I made 100% manual. So on the top left of your screen, you can see the city's off to my left. I should be banking left in a moment to head into the city, and you can kind of see there on my nav map that I'm one waypoint away from my left turn onto final approach. And the autopilot's turning my plane back towards the ocean. I have no idea why. It just randomly started making this hard right bank, and I'm like, what the heck are you doing? So I turned autopilot off, manually turned the plane back over to get towards the runway. But as I started that, the auto throttles just went ballistic on me. And as you can see, I started losing thrust, and then my plane started nosediving, and you can see I've got the elevators in full up and I'm still angling down. At this point, my thrust is starting to hit overspeed, and I've got the engines maxed out. I've finally, I believe, killed the thrust auto throttles and was aiming back up, and I'm trying to make sure I don't hit the ground here. So I start banking. Well, before I started banking, I noticed that my trims were all the wrong way. So the trim on the elevators was pointing the plane straight nose down. So I quickly hit the key to try and raise my elevators back up. In doing so, I jacked the rudder hard to the left. So now the plane's got this left list, but I was finally able to start getting the nose back up on the plane. Now, because the rudder and the elevators and everything had been so hard, I just wanted to stabilize the plane and get over these mountains so I could reassess the situation in a stable position. So I'm trying to figure out how to straighten the plane up, and I used the hotkey a couple of times to kind of manually arrow the rudder over so it wasn't as bad, but I couldn't get it to a place where I felt it was the right, straight, true level. So I'm looking down here, and I'm manually flying, but if you look, my trims are moving. Why are my trims moving at this moment? I had no idea, but it seems like the trims are just manually free floating on this and doing whatever they want to try and keep the plane level in the direction of travel that it's going. So it was very odd. And I noticed that ever since that moment that was kind of what was happening. So that was a very botched approach, and I ended up having to go all the way around and come back in again. Now at the top left is that return approach. Again, on the main window that's taking up the bulk of your screen is my essentially full manual approach and attempt at doing this correctly. I did use the autopilot for a moment to get me lined up with the runway and start kind of a better descent to get me in a good position based on my 3 other failed attempts. So I manually kind of got it lined up, and then I let the autopilot get me fully lined up, and then I kind of messed with everything else after that. So we'll come back to that. So on the top left of the screen now was the third approach attempt, where I was coming in, I had my flaps down, I was trying to keep my throttle at a much better level. You can see the auto throttles currently have me hovering at around 140 knots, which is fine, but I'm not angling down anymore. I'm still staying high up, so I cut it off and started to nose down. But the problem was then I started to gain speed, which put too much lift over the wings, and I started to climb again, so I wasn't descending as fast as I needed to. But this was a catch-22. If I close the flaps, then my speed skyrockets. If I don't, then I end up going too fast and staying too high. So I tried to keep the flaps going, and I pulled the throttles back to idle for a moment, and then about here I rammed full throttle again. But then the trims got me because they'd rolled all the way forward and I couldn't get the nose back up. So you see right there, I'm going plenty fast to get airborne again. I was going about 150, 160 knots when I hit the ground. The problem was that I had the elevators, the trims were pointing the elevators all the way back down to the ground again, so I couldn't get the nose up. It was just this screwy situation, and it ended up causing me to crash again. So I ended up quitting out, resetting the whole scenario, coming back in. Once I was flying, I skipped ahead to the waypoints where I was on my approach, tried to repeat what had happened with the trims, and I just kind of paid attention to what the computer was doing and what I thought it should be doing, and I was kind of able to figure out, okay, yeah, it's not doing quite what it needs to do. So I was watching here very carefully to see if it would actually catch approach, because I was coming in at a much lower altitude on my own. And you can see I don't have auto throttle on at the moment. I'm manually controlling the throttles to try and keep myself at the right altitude, and then I'm using the autopilot to descend my airplane down to 3,700 feet. And I'm coming down, but I'm coming down way too slowly, and it's not working. So I cut all that off here in a second right there. My speed's starting to come up, so I just kind of let myself manually do it a little bit here, because this plane can fly very slow, like most planes can when the flaps are out. So I figured it'd be better to try and float the plane in 100% manually, where I can at least try to set myself up with a better position as I'm on my way in, than what has been happening, where I'm kind of screwed in this approach after the fact, trying to recover what the computer's not doing. Now, of all the planes I've flown, the autopilot system in this handles everything so well, but I don't understand what goes on with some of these approaches. So here I'm using the PAPI lights on the runway there to try and keep myself level and on the glide slope. And then I'm using the screen next to my artificial horizon for the lineup, and I got a little bit off to the side. Now, a lot of this, as I started to get lower, became a bit of a problem of me trying to manage too many things at once, because I hadn't properly managed the thrust. I was trying to keep a close eye to make sure I kept it at the right level so that I could throttle back in time to float onto the runway and do a flare. I was trying to make sure I maintained glide slope, and I was also trying to make sure that I had enough lift to stay in the air, and that my plane would be lined up with the runway. So I was trying to do 4 or 5 different things at once, and it was just a bit too much, because again, I don't have the same level of experience with this big jet as I do with some of the others. This is really the first full manual approach that I've done with it, and was able to get decently down to the ground. So for a fair chunk of this approach, I was 100% manual. I got a little bit high here. I dialed back the throttle a tiny bit as I got in closer and closer, and then I started angling down. I managed my thrust, but then as I got closer to the ground, as I pass onto airport property here, ground effect kind of hit me, and my plane started drifting a little more, and my wings started tipping a lot more right there a little bit. So I managed to kind of recover that, and then I was trying to deal with my throttle and realized I was drifting left. I thought I'd use rudder to crab it, but the rudder doesn't work right. And then I got it down to the ground, and it started lifting again, so I closed my flaps and then just kind of had to angle myself down to keep it on the runway. So because I'd had so many issues with flaps in the past, where I'd kind of kept the flaps overextended and I came in a bit too fast, that's why I made this type of a fast approach. Normally the flaps would be much more extended and I would be flying a lot slower, and I honestly should have done that as I continued to decelerate on my approach. I was just focused on trying to make a smooth landing that aimed at the runway correctly instead of all the floating stuff. And then here I was trying to adjust some of my other settings, and I ended up forgetting that I was parking the plane and overturning, so I kind of stopped on the runway here. But that was a pretty decent landing, if I say so, compared to everything else that's gone wrong, and falling out of the sky, bouncing off the ground at MCO and here. So now that I've at least been able to make a pretty decent approach, I've been able to do things with the flaps more accurately, I think I will be armed to make the return journey back to DFW to complete this short series in a much better light than I did in these last two, because I've learned a lot in the way the plane handles and controls, when to use the autopilot and all that stuff. So I think I'll be doing another manual landing when I get to DFW, but I'll mirror kind of my approach system into that. Now, Costa Rica's airport here is kind of neat. It's got a couple of different areas to it. It's basically one long terminal, but the side that I'm already past has upstairs and a downstairs and a couple aprons where you get to go up the old stairs into it. And then down here at the end is typically where the international flights arrive, because you go straight out of there down into the basement to head over to customs. But the end of the terminal doesn't look quite right. I have some pictures of it. And yeah, that's not quite how the terminal looks. So it's having me park at a terminal where there's no apron. So I decided I'll just turn a little early onto this first one, or second to last one, and I will park at one that actually has an apron that can pull up to the airplane. So I kind of stopped and then had to throttle up. Otherwise, overall, the airport's not too far off from reality. There are certain things that we'll look at here that are fairly outdated, and I'm kind of surprised that, again, since this is mostly based off of satellite imagery, are so outdated, because my first trip to Costa Rica was in 2019, May of 2019, when I took over my current position. And the airport really hasn't changed that much since I've been flying there. I've been there, I think, 6 times now. Up to February 2020, before COVID locked everything down, was my last visit there. And they have a bunch of different systems that are in place at the airport that don't appear to be here in the game. So kind of sad to see that, being when it's supposed to be based off satellite imagery and the outdated terminal stuff. But overall, I did enjoy the flight. I did enjoy the approach. It was great seeing sights that I've actually seen with my own eyes outside the airplane. It was kind of fun to maneuver around there, and I enjoyed it a lot. I had a lot of fun with this one, so hope you enjoyed it. I'm getting better with the plane. I'm still really baffled as to why some of these mistakes and errors happened, and I may, once I complete this journey, try to look into what the heck's happening with the elevator trims, because that's just ridiculous. I don't know why that happens, but every time I notice that it's doing it. So thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.